As the British colonies expanded and prospered in North America, tensions grew. These tensions differed from region to region, but each reflected the difficulties in managing the growing diversity in the colonies. In some ways, this diversity of people, religious practices, ideas, economic status demonstrated the success of the colonies. The British settlements in America struggled, however, to manage this diversity, and tensions often boiled over into open disputes and revolt. In the New England colonies, church and state were intertwined. Puritans objected to political interference in religious affairs, but at the same time expected the church to influence the conduct of politics. They also believed that the state, the government, had an obligation to support and protect the one true church, theirs. As a result, though they came to America seeking freedom of worship, they saw no contradiction in their refusal to grant that freedom to others. In fact, two significant divisions in early Massachusetts were caused by religious disputes and by Massachusetts Bay's unwillingness to tolerate dissent. Roger Williams, a separatist, immigrated to Massachusetts Bay in 1631 and became an assistant pastor in Salem. Williams soon began to express the eccentric ideas that the king had no right to give away land belonging to Native Americans. He also professed the belief that the church and state should be separated, and that Puritans had no right to force their beliefs on others. Banished from Massachusetts in 1635, Williams founded the town of Providence on Narragansett Bay. Because of his beliefs, Providence and other towns in what became the colony of Rhode Island adopted a policy of tolerating all religions, including Judaism. The other dissenter, and an even greater challenge to Massachusetts Bay, was Anne Marbury Hutchinson. She was a follower of John Cotton, a minister who stressed God's free gift of salvation to unworthy humans, the so-called covenant of grace. This covenant of grace meant that God and God alone could save souls for heaven. In 1636, Hutchinson began holding meetings in her home. At first, her gatherings included only women, but later men attended as well. She talked about the covenant of grace, going beyond the views of John Cotton. In fact, Hutchinson embraced the belief that the elect, those selected by God, could communicate directly with God and be assured of their salvation. In doing this, she offered the possibility that Puritans could be relieved of that tension associated with the uncertainty of salvation, whether you could ever know whether you were saved or not. Anne Hutchinson posed two threats, one theological and one social, to the Puritan world. She was charged by the General Court of the colony with having libeled the court's ministers by claiming that they preach salvation through works. That is, she charged that ministers in the colony were preaching a salvation of doing good deeds that went against the beliefs of the covenant of grace. Her banishment to Rhode Island was assured when she stated that God had spoken directly to her. Equally significant was her challenge to the traditional gender roles. Her judges were almost as outraged by what they called her masculine behavior as by her beliefs. One said, "You have stepped out of your place. You have rather been a husband than a wife, and a preacher than a hearer, and a magistrate than a subject." The directness with which the General Court reacted to Anne Hutchinson's disregard of customary feminine behavior indicates the extent to which traditional English family patterns have been duplicated in New England. Most of the men and women who settled in New England called themselves Puritans, but the name did not imply a uniform code of belief and practice. Even the inhabitants of Massachusetts Bay differed among themselves about religion. Congregationalism fostered a growing diversity of opinion and practice because each local church was free to go its own way. By the end of the 1600s, many churches had adopted more liberal standards for admission to membership or to the sacraments of baptism and communion. According to the Puritan worldview, outbreaks of uh, natural catastrophe and other signs indicated the spiritual decay of the culture at large. Beginning in the 1660s, uh, sermons, so-called Jeremiads, were being issued from the pulpits, warning of the decline of Puritan society and the threat that would come with that decline. By the 1680s, the town of Salem was divided into a prosperous town, second only to Boston in size, and a farming village. The town and the village argued over and over again. The villagers were split into factions that fiercely debated whether to seek independence, both political and religious, from the town. In 1689, the villagers won the right to establish their own church and chose the Reverend Samuel Parris, a former merchant, as their minister. Parris was rigid in his ways and had seemingly endless demands for compensation. Many villagers vowed to drive Parris out, and they stopped contributing to his salary in October 1691. Seeking to escape from the tension surrounding her family, Parris's 9-year-old daughter Betty and her cousin Abigail Williams enjoyed listening to the mesmerizing tales spun by Tituba, a slave from Barbados. The girls invited several friends to share in these forbidden stories. Tituba's audience listened intently as she talked of telling the future. Soon, however, Betty Parris began having fits that defied all explanation. So did Abigail Williams and the girl's friend Ann Putnam. Doctors and ministers watched in horror as the girls contorted themselves, cowered under chairs, and shouted nonsense. Lacking any natural explanation, the Puritans turned to the supernatural. They believed the girls had been bewitched. Prodded by Parris and others, they named their tormentors: a disheveled beggar woman named Sarah Good, the elderly Sarah Osborne, and Tituba herself. Osborne claimed her innocence. Good did the same, but pointed the finger at Osborne. Tituba, after being whipped, confessed, and then some. "The devil," she said, "came to me and bid me serve him," she reported in March of 1692. Villagers sat spellbound as Tituba spoke of black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and a white-haired man who bade her to sign the devil's book. There were several undiscovered witches, she said, and they yearned to destroy the Puritans. Finding witches became a crusade, not only for Salem, but all of Massachusetts. Although the accusations of witchcraft at Salem became one of the most notorious examples of this hysteria about witches, the events of 1692, 1693 were neither the first nor the only instances of these accusations in New England. A previous outbreak of witchcraft hysteria had occurred 30 years earlier in Connecticut, during which 13 people were accused of witchcraft, 4 of whom were duly convicted and executed. As events unfolded in Salem, 185 people were accused of witchcraft, 141 women and 44 men. Of that number, 52 women and 7 men were tried. 26 women and 5 men were convicted, and 14 women and 5 men were executed, the last group on September 22, 1692. The true end to the trials, however, came in October when Minister Increase Mather preached a sermon declaring that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. So what caused this outbreak of witchcraft hysteria? Explanations differ as to the underlying causes of this outbreak in Salem. Some historians argue that what happened at Salem was the outgrowth of conflicts between the rising merchant class and the people who were tied to a land-based economy. That is, that the wealth and growing power of the merchants were achieved at the expense of the farmers, and these tensions and resentments boiled over with disastrous results. Other historians interpret the issues somewhat differently. They contend that many of the accused were women with property and no male heirs. These women accused of witchcraft were often widows who had inherited property. Their control of land, of wealth, constituted a threat to an economic system largely based on the orderly transfer of property from father to son. They, like Anne Hutchinson before them, were a threat to the order established by men. Meanwhile, in Virginia colony, tensions arose when the search for new land to grow the tobacco crop were running up against the limits of treaties that had been formed with Native Americans. We must defend ourselves against all Indians in general, for that they were all enemies. These are the words of Nathaniel Bacon, a wealthy Englishman who had recently settled in the backcountry of Virginia. The opinion that all Indians were enemies was also shared by many other Virginians, especially those who lived in the interior of the colony. It was not the view, however, of the governor of the colony, William Berkeley. Berkeley was not opposed to fighting Indians who were considered enemies, but attacking friendly Indians, he thought, could lead to what everyone wanted to avoid, or war with all the Indians against us. Berkeley also didn't trust Bacon's intentions, believing that the upstart's true aim was to stir up trouble among settlers who were already discontent with the colony's government. Bacon attracted a large following who, like him, wanted to kill or drive out every Indian in Virginia. In 1675, when Berkeley denied Bacon a commission, that is, the authority to lead soldiers, Bacon took it upon himself to lead his followers in a crusade against the enemy. They marched to a fort held by a friendly tribe, the Occaneechees, and convinced them to capture warriors from an unfriendly tribe. The Occaneechees returned with captives. Bacon's men killed the captives. Then they turned on their allies and opened fire. Berkeley declared Bacon a rebel and charged him with treason. Just to be safe, the next time Bacon returned to Jamestown, he brought along 50 armed men. Bacon was still arrested, but Berkeley pardoned him instead of sentencing him to death, the usual punishment for treason. Still, without the commission he felt he deserved, Bacon returned to Jamestown later this same month, but this time with 500 men. Berkeley was forced to give Bacon the commission only later to declare that it was invalid. Bacon, in the meantime, had continued his fight against Indians. When he learned of the governor's declaration, he headed back to Jamestown. The governor immediately fled, along with a few of his supporters, to Virginia's eastern shore. Each leader tried to muster support. Each promised freedom to slaves and indentured servants who would join their cause. But Bacon's following was much greater than Berkeley's. In September of 1676, Bacon and his men, indentured servants, and slaves set Jamestown on fire. The rebellion ended after British authorities sent a royal force to assist in putting down the uprising and arresting scores of committed rebels, both indentured servant and African slave. When Bacon suddenly died in October, probably of dysentery, Bacon's rebellion fizzled out. Bacon's rebellion demonstrated that poor indentured servants and poor African slaves could be united in a cause. This was a great fear of the ruling class. What would prevent the poor from uniting to fight them? This fear most likely hastened the transition away from indentured servitude to racialized African slavery. In all of the colonies, their growth marked the success of the British settlement of North America. With this success, however, came rising tensions as the diversity in the colony, religious, economic, threatened to separate what had been the successful settlement of a large stretch of the eastern seaboard. In the coming years, the rise of racial division, the institution of slavery, the attempt by the English government to regulate the colonies even further would come to cause further tensions that would lead the 13 colonies of the British Empire to begin questioning its relationship to the motherland and whether there was a need to further define that relationship or break away completely.